John Kimball, welcome to the Tech 45 podcast. So good to
Thanks
see
for
you. I
having me.
wish,
Yeah,
yeah. We're overdue for an in-person get together.
for sure.
Uh, but this is like the next best thing. So this is so cool seeing you. Um, I've loved kind of following along with your life and your career success,
Hmm.
the different leadership positions you've taken in the Army Reserves. And that's how we met. I mean, we met at Fort Bragg,
Yeah, Triple
North
C,
Carolina.
Civil Affairs. That's right. Yep,
It's not Fort Bragg anymore. Sorry,
that's
Fort
true.
Liberty.
Port Liberty. Everyone on X still calls it Bragg with all the recent things that have been happening. So no one's picked up on the Liberty yet. So yeah.
Oh my gosh. It was so speaking of X and I don't know if you've heard of this podcast. It's a small little production called Joe Rogan. Have you heard of this
Yeah. I
podcast?
think I've heard of that guy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's like an amateur podcast, but yeah, one of my friends was playing it in his Toyota, and some people in his family are not like, super fans of that
Hmm.
podcast. And he goes, "Oh, sorry. Let me turn off my conspiracies." And I just thought that was so funny. I'm like,
Yeah, that's
and
definitely a
X.
way to start out. Thanksgiving or Christmas holidays with your family for sure. Yeah.
Yeah. It's interesting that like any bozo like me can start this up now. I started this podcast almost a year ago because my
Hmm.
StreamYard subscription is about to renew, and they hiked the price to 80%. So I'm probably gonna
Oh
switch to
wow.
Riverside.
Okay.
Yeah, but all of these like browser-based platforms, like some of them are fairly inexpensive, and then some of them are actually free open source software. So I might look at some of those.
Yeah.
But like any bozo with the microphone I started out with is like $50, and I was using just like a Logitech webcam. So I want to look at my old podcast and compare
Yeah,
them
see
to
how things have
today.
progressed. Yeah, I might have to upgrade myself. Like I said, I borrowed some of my son's equipment. He's got a microphone, and he was kind enough. I was actually originally going to be back at my home in Nevada, but unfortunately my wife's grandfather passed away, so we decided to stay in the state and then go to his funeral, which is this weekend. But as a result, I'm broadcasting live from an Airbnb, but it's all good.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Cool, man. I need to do more of that. I've taken like my setup on the road. I have like a travel
Hmm.
setup, but I haven't done a lot of video production when I'm on the road. I want to start
Yeah.
doing that more often. And because like it's so easy to do. Like literally like Spotify, like, thank you, Daniel Eck, but he made it like so easy to start a podcast. It literally
That's
takes
good.
5 minutes. Like
Yeah.
if you have a Gmail account and a cheap microphone and
Yeah.
a webcam or even a cell phone, you
Yep.
can start a podcast in like 5 minutes, and you can post it on YouTube, Spotify. So it's been a fun like creative outlet for me. There's no like monetary gain. Really, it doesn't really do anything for me except the pure enjoyment out of it,
Yeah.
which is so cool. So yeah,
No, it's interesting you mentioned that. My sister, her podcast is Do Something More. But
love
she's
that.
she's she's kind of giving me the plug. Hey, you got to start a podcast. You got to start doing this, that. So for the New Year's, I'm pretty big into what I would call sustainability, growing my own food. We got solar. We do water collection, water storage.
Yes.
We got rabbits and chickens. We're looking at doing goats eventually, but I've thought about doing like a YouTube channel. Probably podcast is a little much, but a YouTube channel, just trying to eat something off of my property every day for 365 days. You know.
Oh,
So.
that's so cool. I love that. Yeah, there was this guy that lived down the street from me in Orlando. I'll pull up. I'll give him a little plug. His name's Rob Greenfield, but he did this project that was similar to what you're describing,
Hmm.
um, and where for a year, he only ate things that he foraged or grew
Yeah.
himself.
Yep.
And I don't know if you heard of that project, but this guy's a big sustainability guy. And let me play this video real quick. I'm gonna share it.
Oh,
Hopefully, I
that's
don't get
cool.
like canceled or whatever. But uh, hopefully, I don't get like a copyright infringement. But whatever. I'm gonna give this guy a plug anyway. Um, so he grew his own food for a year, and like I walked by this guy's house. He lived like right down the street from me in Orlando,
Yeah.
and he would forage stuff. He would get coconuts from South Florida. And then he basically turned his front yard and a lot of his neighbors' front yards into food forests. So
Yeah.
instead of growing like a lawn, like it was so cool. And we used to walk through this neighborhood, and it basically like he turned his front yard to a food forest like this.
Yeah.
And he encouraged his neighbors to do the same thing. I just thought it was like such an incredible thing to do. And there's others like him that are doing this on the West Coast and around the world. I think it's amazing. I think
Yeah.
if you grow food, most of the world used to be like their daily life used to include some sort of agriculture,
Yep.
and now it's like less than 1% of people are engaged in agriculture. I guess you being one of them. So
Yeah, well, not like for me, I grew up. My parents always had a garden, and both sets of my grandparents farmed. I feel like I'm an old soul. My grandfather on my mom's side, he was born in 1900. So I
okay,
grew up listening to stories and having a perspective on life that I would say is a little different than the average bear my age. But one of the things I've
sure,
always thought about, like with agriculture and everything, that's pretty wild is I feel like, when I talk to my grandparents or look at how they lived, they had to be jacks of all trades. You know what I mean?
yeah, yep,
They had to know machinery, they had to know, animal husbandry, they had to deal with agriculture, and they also had like a full time job, you know? And what I've thought about a lot is, their generation had to be jacks of all trades. And then the last couple generations, it seems like things have kind of swung back over to the being highly specific, right? Highly trained engineer, highly trained lawyer, go to school for 8 years to become a doctor, a dentist. And one of the things I've thought about a lot is with the advent of AI, if we all have a robot in our home, I don't have to have necessarily a mechanic, and we can get back to maybe being a little more of a jack of all trades,
oh,
and
cool.
essentially managing and being a little more sustainable if we're able to leverage AI and robotics to do a lot of those things that we rely on other specialists to do, if that makes sense.
Oh,
You
that
know what I mean?
no, that makes a lot of sense, and I've actually never heard that take. I
Yeah.
was literally riding bikes with my friend Graham. We did a little bike ride,
Hmm.
around the DC area here, and we were talking about that exactly. And so we brought up two examples of robotics applications, and the first was like, hey, he was talking to a plumber in our neighborhood. He's like, oh, well, plumbing will never be replaced by robotics, and I was like, Graham, I was like,
Yeah.
there's robots that are implanting like brain chips into people's
Yeah.
cerebrums. I'm like,
It'll happen. Give it some
of
time.
course, plumbing will be
Yeah.
will be replaced by robotics. He was like, oh, I didn't think about that. And then I had a conversation today or yesterday about the same thing. I'm like, the only reason it hasn't happened yet is because robotic applications have just been implemented in the highest ROI use cases. So
Yeah.
surgery, obviously high ROI, right? So if you have a neurosurgeon that is making 2 million a year and he's making the hospital like 10 times that in revenue, of course they want to make him more efficient, and there's just not
Yeah.
enough of him. So of course they're going to augment his abilities with robotics,
Hmm.
but that just hasn't trickled down to every industry.
Yeah.
It's been
But I
in
mean, it'll
automation, and yeah,
yeah, I mean, it'll definitely get there. I think that
it will.
that's kind of spot on. But like I said, instead of, I think some people have reason to be scared of it, and there's a lot for society to figure out. But on the other side of the coin, right? It's like I always look at the like for example, Star Wars is the example I always use, and what I mean by that is you always have one or two people, and they're dictating what needs to be done to an army of robots. And so essentially, what you have is if I can interface with AI, give it my conscious intent, right? And then have it do what I want to do, whether that's pulling weeds or, cleaning out the gutters, what have you, optimizing the way my home functions. All it's going to do is make human work far more efficient and effective. So I'm excited to see what the future holds. So yeah.
Yeah, I am too. Yeah, I think it makes a lot of people nervous, but I always reference, the advent of the automobile, transitioning from
Yeah.
horsepower to horsepower, right?
Yeah.
And then the advent of people no longer having to, work 18-hour days in the
Hmm.
fields and in agriculture. Like, now we have GPS guided tractors and plows. And so no, I think you're right. And I've never heard that take before where people can actually have the opportunity in the future with some of these robotics applications like you're talking about, satellite internet. People can be
Hmm.
a lot more self-sufficient, and we might have these little ecosystems in our backyard where we can actually sustain ourselves at a much lesser impact to the world. I
Yeah.
think
And
that
I think
yeah,
yeah, not only the lesser impact, but you can get back to being a generalist. You can be a jack of all trades, master of none, because that mastery part, you just engage with the AI, right? But I'm going to need to know a little bit about whether it's gardening or plumbing or electrical. You know what I mean? But if I know enough to instruct the AI or engage with the AI, right, and the robot to do whatever I want it to do, I can get back to being a generalist just like my grandparents, except instead of taking care of a 10-acre farm, now I can manage a much larger plot or get a lot more things done, if you will. So I'm really excited about it. And for my career, I would say I'm also a jack of all trades, master of none. So it definitely appeals to my personality as well. That those opportunities, I guess you could say.
Yeah. No, same here. I've had a similar experience where I've had a very, like you, I've had a very diverse career. I've worked in aerospace, aviation, robotics. I was an infantry officer, which was a crazy
Yeah.
experience. And I liked learning all these skill sets. Like the
Hmm.
infantry officer period of my life was cool because I had to like kind of know a little bit about radios, a little bit about tactics, a little bit about leadership, a little bit
Yeah.
about, night vision goggles, how to emplace machine guns, mortars, how to operate a diesel motor. Like I like that kind of environment. And I find myself, and I know this will resonate with you, I find myself getting bored just doing one
Yep.
thing.
Oh yeah. Yeah, and I feel like a lot of times the way I've set up my life now is to kind of counteract that boredom, always moving on to the next thing. So yeah, for sure, I 100% agree. Yep, and that's like in my life, I've worked. Right now I work in manufacturing tech. Previously, I worked in mining industry,
Hmm.
and obviously with the military as well. I've seen a lot, done a lot, and yeah, I love the variety. So
Totally. Yeah. So my first interaction with a robot, if you will, I mean, it was just a teleop robot,
hmm
but we had a couple of unmanned systems, and one of them was purpose built for the military. It was called the King. It was a Croatian company that built basically a small tracked vehicle for route clearance. And I'll put
yeah,
a picture up here. Yeah, I'll put a picture of the King. You can see it. It's a RF controlled device. And then the other one was actually a Bobcat that was beefed up, and they put an applique kit on it so it could be remote controlled. And so
oh
for those
nice,
that are not in the robotics field, like John and I, an applique kit is essentially a kit that enables a piece of machinery to be remote controlled. So think like a piece of Caterpillar equipment, or in this case was a Bobcat. It was literally a Bobcat that you could drive, but you could also get out of it. And this thing was modified by the Army by one of the rapid acquisition programs, and you could remote control it from about 100 yards away, give or take. And so this is like kind of like the beginning right now. Like they're starting to make these types of kits that interface with heavy machinery, with cars, with drones. I mean, so now they're making things that weren't really designed to be remote controlled. They're
yeah.
making them remote controlled. And the next step, and kind of what John and I are likely working on, are vehicles that are actually designed to either be teleop, remote controlled, or operate autonomously.
Yeah. And I think that whole operation autonomously allows you to, rethink entire industries, because I worked in mining. And so all the haul trucks, all the way they were designed, everything was about optimizing human labor, right? And the second you're able to get away from human labor, I mean, it's going to cause a cascading effect in terms of efficiencies and opportunities to improve. And it reminds me of a quote. I think I sent it to you from Naval Ravikant, and essentially he said, "We're in a race between AI, robotics, and improvements in technology versus regulations." And I thought that was pretty interesting take on everything. But I think as long as the government can kind of get out of the way and allow people to innovate efficiently, effectively, safely, we're about to see a windfall of a lot of different things in the next 5 to 20 years, I would say. So, yeah.
Yeah, I often say to my family and friends exactly what you just said. I'm like, the future in 5 to 10 years is going to be unrecognizable.
Yeah.
And I saw an article today. I almost sent it to you, but I figured we just throw it up on the podcast.
Yeah. No worries.
So there's this mine in Perth, which I think is in Australia, right?
Yeah. They have
And they've
Western
made
Australia.
Western Australia. So I'm not sure what they're mining for, iron ore, I guess. But this article in the BBC Business section details how this company, they don't know how much they've invested in autonomy, but they're up to, they say there's about up to about like maybe 2,000 mining specific vehicles that are now operating autonomously in the world. And one of the big investments that were made was here. And I think Caterpillar and Komatsu are both making
Yeah.
significant investments in this technology for good reason, right?
Yep.
But I
Yeah.
almost said this to y'all. Yeah,
Yeah. I worked a lot with Caterpillar, and they did a lot of the remote stuff, and we did some headings or some active mining areas where we tested it out. Um, Honestly, the tech though that I was most impressed with is I work in safety and health, and so we're always looking at how to mitigate accidents. But the one I was most impressed with was it was a device that could monitor fatigue,
mm.
and it would be able to pick up when people were like likely to essentially fall asleep. And I
Oh,
remember I went and, it's a lot easier to implement those types of technologies where you're actively monitoring people in, non-US locations, just because people don't have as much of an aversion. And a lot of people, to be honest, in the global south, they're just happy to have a job a lot of times, right? So they don't really push back as much. But obviously in the United States, there's a lot of pushback about, you're going to monitor me, you're going to have an active camera while I'm driving this haul truck. And so we were able to essentially do it like a pilot, if you will, a pilot kind of rollout. And one of the most kind of impressive things that we went through was, we only had a handful of people using it, but one of the individuals actually fell asleep while he was driving. The system alerted, right? And we had him come up from underground. We said, "Hey, you fell asleep," and he was like, "No, I didn't. I didn't fall asleep." And he swore up and down. So we showed him the video, and it wasn't. He didn't like pass out, but he was dropping into micro sleeps for a good
yeah.
10, 15, 20 seconds. And anybody who's worked an underground mine, that can be the difference between life and death. And so
Oh,
what
yeah.
was really impressive was, he saw that video of himself falling asleep, and he completely changed his perception and his demeanor towards the technology. And then we actually used him essentially as an asset to then advocate for its use later on down the line. And so I think with a lot of these technologies, you're going to see a lot of initial resistance, and essentially showing how it improves human capital and improves, human life, is going to get that adoption to move a lot quicker. But unless you can get that piece right, I think it's going to be a bumpy road. And so, you look at, like, for example, all of this debt that needs to be turned over. You look at all of the capital investment that needs to go into AI and robotics. And in my opinion, if we don't get the human piece right, and I know there's been a lot of talk like about UBI and everything else, if we don't get that piece right, I think, you're going to light a fuse, and you're not going to see those capital investments, and you're not going to see that growth like we need to. So it'll be interesting to see, but that's kind of my 2 cents on the topic, because you got to get all the pieces of the puzzle to fit correctly, if you will. So
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I've thought a lot about this with like high risk jobs like
yeah.
mining. I think mining falls in that
Mhm.
category. And, I think working conditions in general over, human existence have gotten
Yeah.
safer and safer. And I see technology as a good way to eliminate, either life altering injuries or, in my case, I used robotics to clear IEDs in Afghanistan. It was life saving. Both of those robots got blown up. I could have used 30 of them. Both of them
Yeah.
became inoperative, but, mission success. There was nobody near the robot when it blew up, and I could have used a whole fleet of those things. I mean, the Army couldn't field enough of those things. And I wanted to talk about mining for a second because I
Yeah.
think a
Yeah.
lot of people they don't quite understand like the scale of these mining
Oh yeah.
operations because I didn't until I talked to you. So I
Yeah.
want to throw up a video on the screen real quick, just because and talk a little bit about sub-level cave mining. I don't know, maybe you can help me narrate this, but
Yeah.
like talk through this. I mean, some of these drifts are what, miles underground, right?
Yeah. So I mean, like, one of the mines I worked at, it was kind of fun because it would put the elevation above sea level for the kind of the station that you would stop at, if you will. And it was in northern Nevada that I worked at, and the mine, I think the elevation started around, it was right around like 5,000 or 5,500 feet. And
Deep
I believe the bottom cage was like 1,500 feet. So I mean, you're talking,
underground.
yeah, well,
Okay.
1,500 feet, yeah, so it was like 1,500 feet underground. So like the cage would stop, at like, what is that, 4,000? I think actually the lowest one that went down to like 3,500 feet above sea level. So a couple thousand feet underground. So
Oh
yeah,
my
so I mean, it's
gosh.
it's very. it's uh it's impressive, the scales and everything. And I never actually, so I did an internship in a stope uh, KV mine like this, and I actually have a friend. He's like a mining engineer that designs these types of excavation plans for companies and whatnot. Most of what I did was what they called drift and backfill,
Yep.
and so it was a little different. And the main reason we did that was because the ground was so unstable. But yeah, when you get underground and you see the amount of dirt that's moved, it is mind boggling. And I think probably the funnest thing is whenever you talk to people, if they're interested and the conversation keeps going, and you get into a conversation about grade, right? And when you tell them, yeah, the mine I worked at, the highest grade for gold, this was, I think at the time we were running like half an ounce to zero point 0.6 ounces per ton. You know what I mean? So you're just
Crazy.
moving massive amounts of rock. And for all the earth that goes up, we had cement backfill that basically we would put in, and then it would cure, and then they would go underneath and they would mine that. And so you would get like 3 layers with just concrete, and those bottom layers, because the concrete was so stable compared to the native rock, if you will, and it really wasn't rock, it was more like sand or mud half the time. Because the concrete was a lot stronger, the headings could be a lot bigger. And so at the top, you would start with like an 8 by 8 foot or 10 by 10 foot heading, because the bigger it was, the more likely it was to kind of cave in, if you will. And then
Yep.
by the bottom, they were able to widen those all the way out to be, if my memory serves me correct, it's been a few years, like 20 feet by 20 feet, you know.
Oh my
But
gosh.
I would say my favorite part. So I'll talk through kind of the rotation that they would go through at the mine I worked at. So essentially, the first thing that they would do is you would have what we call jumbo drills, and probably one of the things I love about my career, and if you want to look this up, you can. Is when I started my career, this would have been 2012. They were still using what are called jack legs. All right. And for those that aren't familiar with those, they're basically a pneumatic type drill that drills into the rock face to then put your explosives into it, right? And the pneumatic drill, the jackleg, if you will, was invented and designed in Virginia City, which is where one of the largest gold silver deposits ever mined. It actually helped turn the tide of the Civil War, believe it or not. So if you ever get a chance, you're in Nevada, go check out Virginia City. It's totally worth it. That's where it was invented, and it was like the end of the 1800s, basically, is when the jackleg was invented. And
Okay.
currently in my career, we're talking about. I work with a lot of material engineers talking about chemistries and technologies that will likely impact industry for another 50. So I always take a step back and I think about how I have interacted with technology that my lifetime will span almost 200 years, and it's
It's
always
crazy.
kind of, yeah, it's very crazy to think about. And it's always impressive to see how innovation oftentimes starts slowly and builds upon itself, right? Those standard S curves that they always talk about, right?
Yeah.
So it builds slowly, then it hits that innovation curve, moves rapidly, and then it slows down again.
Totally.
But anyway, so back to kind of what I was saying. So we'd always start by doing having a jumbo drill or a jack leg, and it would drill all the holes. Then you'd fill it essentially. Yeah, this is what a jumbo looks like. And then the explosive crew would come in. They would fill it in with explosives, right? And then essentially they would blast all of this rock out. And then at that point in time, you would bring in a mucker, and the mucker would essentially remove all of the dirt and then put it onto loaders that would come out. And then they would have they were like jumbos. They would go in and then they would put up all of our steel sets, and they basically have these steel beams that you drill into the dirt and then you fill with water, and then they would expand, compress the rock, right? And we'd use those expansion bolts as well as wire mesh and shotcrete cement to essentially shore up the ground, and then you'd go through another cycle. And probably my
Oh my
favorite
gosh.
time in mining, so I did, like I said, I did a lot of safety and health work, did a lot of incident investigations. Luckily, I never had to deal directly with any fatalities, but we had a lot of near misses. And one of my favorite things that I did, though, when I worked in this at this company, was they let me go underground and work with the day to day workers for like a month, just to
Cool.
understand, right? Because it's really easy for an engineer, a safety person, to say, "Hey, you should be doing X, Y, Z," without understanding all the variables that go into a person's day. And
Yeah.
so I worked on the bull gang, and all the bull gang did was move the air, water, and electrical to and from the face. So we'd get it as close to the face where the actual work was going on, while the jumbos were doing their thing and the blasters were doing their thing. And before they would blast the rock, we'd have to pull all of that infrastructure back so it didn't get damaged, right? And then after it got mucked out, we would push it forward again. And so we would drive down into these areas, and so these electrical cables that they're full of copper, they're like heavy as snot, and you also have these vent bags. It's like not glamorous work at all. And I just really enjoyed it because you're underground, it's 90 95 degrees plus, 80 85% humidity, you're sweating like a dog, but you got a good team, you got a good crew, and you can get a lot done. And it was very rewarding labor, and I think our modern day, we miss some of that. If you don't have that physical aspect to it, you don't I just feel like you don't always feel as accomplished, so that was very, very enjoyable, and it just helped me understand the blue collar mindset a little more, if you will. And I think it earns you points, and earns you a lot of points and respect from the guys as well. So yeah,
Oh yeah, no, it definitely does. And what you're saying resonates deeply with me because I feel good after like a hard day's, physical labor or like a
yeah,
really strenuous bike ride or run. Like I feel good about myself, and I think there's something innate to the human psyche that it's almost like its own sense of reward. And you sleep
yeah,
like a baby. I mean, you sleep
oh
so
yeah,
good too. So
yeah,
like that's an added benefit too. But I mean, tell me, before we move on, I wanted to ask you too, like, what are some of the other unique challenges? Let's say you're, a few thousand feet underground,
yep.
and what comes to mind initially is you have diesel vehicles that are operating underground. Like, how do you exhaust those fumes and like that diesel particulate? Like, that seems like that and other challenges seems like a really unique EHS nightmare to
Oh, it
me.
was. Yeah, absolutely was. And it's really, I'm gonna be, have my bleeding heart out here a little bit, because there was a couple projects that I was never quite to get across the finish line.
I hear
And if
you.
any of your listeners are out there, I kid you not, hit me up in the next year or two. I will literally work for free to solve this problem, because that's how
Wow.
passionate I am about it. But
Amazing.
so yeah, so I'll go through like a couple kind of key aspects. So there were dedicated ventilation engineers, and I worked my discipline. What I formally got trained in is called industrial hygiene. Right, I have my certified industrial hygienist certification. I'm looking at doing my CSP this year, certified safety professional. But long story short, we had dedicated ventilation engineers, and we would work with them, but there were kind of legal requirements, and then there were best practice requirements that essentially said for every horsepower, X horsepower of diesel exhaust or diesel equipment, right, you have to have so much CFM, or cubic feet per minute, of airflow, right?
Okay.
And so they would pick out a given area of the mine, and then they would say, okay, we have, at max, we'll have two haul trucks and two loaders in this area, right? And so then they would do the math, and they'd say, okay, so we need XYZ amount of ventilation, and then they would run it through their software, and then the software would tell them, hey, you need this many booster fans, this is where you need to place them. And then the ventilation engineers, they'd actually go underground, and they'd use what's called an anemometer to basically measure the wind flow through the tunnels. And I
Yeah.
helped I helped do some of that as well. And then what my team did is we would go in afterwards, and we would measure the diesel particulate matter. We basically would put devices on individuals that would pull the air through, collect the diesel particulate. In this mine, we also had a lot of arsenic. So, kind of the trifecta for your lungs in terms of causing long term lung cancer was arsenic, silica, and diesel particulate matter. So, we
Okay.
had all three. And a lot of the way that we tried to control it was primarily through ventilation, right? So the projects that I worked on, some of them were success, some of them weren't. But a lot of the projects that I worked on was like how to optimize, for example, the use of water trucks to keep dust down. You know, Another one that we worked on a lot is we were able to find that a lot of the cabs had pretty good filtration in terms of airflow into the cab. But if you didn't maintain the seals and the proper pressure inside to outside, then a lot of times they would get those contaminants that would leak in, right?
Oh,
And so we did
okay.
a lot of work to essentially standardize this is the pressure that you need, as well as drill holes in the cab and provide the maintenance and the mechanics the ability to measure whenever the truck would roll through for its maintenance checks, right? essentially they'd be able to measure the pressure inside versus outside and say, okay, this truck either does or doesn't meet the requirements. Give me 1 second. I got to plug in
Yeah.
my
No, do your
computer
thing,
here.
man. Yeah, we can just edit this part out. It's super easy.
Yeah, no worries.
Um, yeah, I've gotten way better at editing. That's one thing that like I can do way better at, which is interesting, you know. Yeah, I've had this happen a couple times, both for myself and for
Yeah.
guests.
No, it's all good. Like I said,
And we got two camera angles too, so like editing's even easier now that I download the local footage, so that we have two separate camera angles.
yeah, no, I'm good now. So anyway, so like I
Yeah,
was saying, so that was like a lot of the stuff that we did, and a lot of that was all good. So you had the ventilation, you had the pressurization of the cabs, you had the water trucks to try and keep the dust down. But what me and my team tried to do when I was there is we reached out to an engineering firm, and we essentially asked and said, "Hey, is there a way for you to design a filter that we can put on our booster fans to essentially reduce?" And there's no way you're ever going to eliminate it, right? Because if you have a filter that removes a lot of the dust, it's going to get clogged up really quickly. It's going to have a lot of pressure on the fan, and you're not going to get the throughput that you need. But we were able to essentially, with this engineering team, design a baffle or a filter that would knock down about like 50-60% of the dust. And we had set up like an array of dust monitors throughout the mine to measure how dusty it was. And we knew at most the arsenic at the highest concentration was about 3%. Basically, we knew if you went anywhere in the mine, 95% of the time or less, it's going to be at 3% or less, right? So essentially, we assumed, right, as a conservative estimate, all of the mine has 3% arsenic in the dust, and then we had
wow.
these dust monitors throughout the whole mine, so we could kind of vaguely see kind of hot spots risk wise where people were being exposed to excessive levels of arsenic. And the idea was at all these different booster fans where the air essentially gets picked up and pushed further down into the mine, we could slap one of these on there. And we did all the calculations, and the filters would only need to be changed like once every month or once every quarter. And it would knock down our exposures theoretically by anywhere from 30 to 60%, right? So we purchased this filtration device. We got it on site. And then unfortunately, the location we were going to install it, we found out it wasn't going to work. So we had to find a different location, and I ended up getting a different job offer, and that was one of the hardest things for me. Was, do I stay here and put this feather in my cap as kind of a crowning achievement during my time here, or do I take this other opportunity with this other job? And fortunately, I would say for my own personal learning and obviously financially, taking another job was the right choice for me and my family. But there's a
Sure.
lot of days where I wish I could have stayed and finished this project. So unfortunately, I kind of left the project in the hands of a lot of my friends and colleagues that were there. And literally, I think it was like the week or 2 weeks prior to them installing it, the area we were going to install it had a massive cave in. And luckily, no one
Oh,
died. But then what happened is that sat for another month or two, never got used. And I think one of the things that a lot of people don't understand is the culture of your organization is very important. And a lot of the people that I had worked with, they all left to different areas, different locations. And last I had heard, they never installed that filter or tried to get that control in place. And I think it's really unfortunate when, like, one of the things I've always talked about my entire career, 80% of the work, 90% of the work, it doesn't matter. If you don't get that 100%, you're not gonna get the fruits of your labor. And so building a culture, building a team that can see those things through is so important for leaders in any industry or really anywhere in your community. It doesn't really matter. So yeah, so that's a lot of the work that I did. And what's interesting too is beyond just the air monitoring, the sampling, the controls, we also did a lot of biological monitoring where we'd actually monitor urine. And at that mine we did urine. At other mines that I worked at, we did mercury, thallium, lead, right? But I loved really seeing everything, kind of putting everything together, right? You had to understand the industrial process extremely well to know where those exposures were occurring. And then you also have to understand the human body extremely well to understand what happens to those exposures once they occur, you know?
Oh,
and
that's
then taking
cool.
both of those disparate concepts and then painting a risk for people and then helping those people. It's very rewarding work. And I'll finish with this story, and then we can kind of move on from mining if you want. But
It's up to you.
one of my favorite experiences was uh, I worked at a startup mine. I don't recommend that for anyone. Startups are hard, mines are hard. Startup mines is like times 10. And I always say, people at my current role, sometimes people say, how have you lasted so long? And I always point to this previous employer as to why I've lasted so long in my current role. But essentially, it was a startup mine, and it was just very chaotic. And we had silica exposures that were just astronomical. I mean,
Oh
they
man.
were 2-3 times the legal limit, and it wasn't ideal. And luckily, I was able to go in there, and we were able to put a lot of controls in place. And it really was just properly maintaining the equipment. I mean, it wasn't anything out of the ordinary. It was very basic stuff, but we were able to get everything regimented, set up, with the proper control, proper culture, proper procedure to manage it, and we were able to see those go from 2 to 3 times the legal limit to 50% of the legal limit. And I remember specifically there was a gentleman who operated the shovel for one of the pits, and we were monitoring him to essentially validate that all our controls worked. And as soon as he saw me, he saw the van, kind of the EHS van, pull up into the pit, and he called me on the radio, and he knew it was me. He shut down the entire pit just to have me walk up to him and shake his hand, and he just wanted to tell me thank you for
Oh
the work that
wow.
I'd done. And you don't always get that, but he saw what our efforts had done. He understood from a technical standpoint what it meant for his long term health and well being, and that I was it was very yeah, it was great to have that recognition. And that's a big deal. You don't shut down the main pit when you're running operations, but he did that just to say thank you. So yeah, that's a memory I'll carry for a long time.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I mean, anytime you're privileged with, leading an operation like that, that's complex, or leading people, you have an opportunity to really positively impact someone's life. And in your case, like you might impact their life for a long time because
Oh yeah.
some of these exposures you're describing, likely can cause lifelong problems for these
Oh,
people.
100%. Yep. Yeah,
So
and
you're
that's what I love
actually
about my
changing it.
job. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
No, I love that. Yeah, I mean, you're literally, what you're doing is changing the quality of their life long term. And I think, some people, I had this when I was working in the aviation, industry. And we had some of the tools you mentioned too, where we would, test the pressurization of the pressure vessel, the
yeah.
fuselage of the aircraft. But we also worked with a lot of really dangerous chemicals. Some of the hydraulic fluids that were on older aircraft were very, very corrosive and terrible for the human body. Some of the painting compounds, as you can
Yeah.
imagine, aircraft paint is toxic. And, I definitely underappreciated, what our EHS people did to protect our guys. There's like the ventilation systems, the drainage systems to make sure like the paint was being properly disposed of. It's
Yep.
not just an environmental thing, it's like a human exposure thing. And quite honestly, I would love to see, our kids in the future live in a world where they're not breathing particulate matter from, diesel and gas
Oh, 100%.
cars. I
Yeah.
think it's a real thing.
Oh yeah. When I drive a Tesla, and people always talk about the electrical aspect, but I think the pollution aspect is often ones that goes way undersold.
It does.
Then the other one is maintenance. But I agree, not only in the workplace, but hopefully just general environment, we can make the world a better place to live. 100%.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
think so too. I saw a short video of a city in Asia, I presume China,
Yeah.
but all the cars were EVs in like a
Hmm.
very like a high density, like a New York City. Think Manhattan, like
Yeah.
but just on the other side of the planet, and it was just totally quiet. Like the noise pollution too is a real
Yeah.
thing. Like it was totally quiet besides the honking of the horns. Of course, they were honking
Yeah.
horns, right? Like they do in New York City. But like the person walking around that was filming it was from a Western country, and they were just like, "Oh wow, like it's so quiet here at night," and that's because all the cars were EVs. And yeah, I always look forward, especially when you have cold weather, when the air density is really high. You tend to breathe, you tend to smell the particulate matter from gas cars more. I feel
Yeah.
like
Hmm.
so when I'm running and biking, I get a whiff of it, and it's like, oh man, it's like I know I didn't breathe in, pure air there. There was definitely some fumes that I breathed in.
Yeah. No, it's
Yeah.
interesting you mentioned that too, because I grew up in Utah, And for anybody that's been there in the wintertime, they'll get these horrible inversions. Even in the
Yep.
summertime, they'll get a lot of pollution that builds up. But oftentimes, especially in the wintertime with the inversions, Salt Lake City will be one of the worst rated cities in the country for
Yeah.
pollution. And it's an issue I follow pretty closely because I went to school in Utah. I have family that still lives in Utah. And one of the interesting things to kind of watch or see is anytime the issue of pollution gets brought up, right? Everyone points to Kennecott Copper, right? The mining company. They'll point to industry when it's like 65-70% of the pollution comes from people driving their cars, you know?
Yep.
And so it's frustrating to me when the solution is there in front of them and people can be empowered to do the right thing, but someone else is always the boogeyman, and it's like, I think a lot about culture because when you talk about leadership, honestly, if you have a good culture, your job's easy as a leader, 100%. And so, how do we get back to a culture of accountability in the United States and one where people feel empowered and want to do the right thing, you know? So,
Wow. Okay, you just asked a really like good fundamental question. Anybody that's an elected leader or a
yeah,
government official, listen up. I mean, how do you promote that type of culture? Because some countries have it, some countries don't. My favorite one of my favorite YouTube videos is like this camera crew goes around and they leave a block of silver bullion, a real block of silver bullion in various metropolitan cities around the
yeah,
earth. And like Tokyo, nobody
doesn't get
steals it.
touched.
Nobody
Yeah.
touches it. It doesn't.
Uh-huh.
Nobody even looks at it. It's like, oh, it's not mine. A couple people look down at it because they're fascinated by a silver
Yeah.
bullion.
That's a lot of
Like,
money too.
it's a lot of money. Yeah, this is like a couple grand worth of silver,
Yeah.
and then and you can guess which cities the silver
Been,
lasts in,
yeah.
and which. But I don't know. And that's an extreme example. But what you're
Yeah.
saying is true. Like if in my experience, when I've had the privilege of leading people in a really great culture, oh my gosh, it's so easy. And you can certainly do a lot of stuff to foster that as a leader. There's
Yeah.
definitely incentive structures you can put in place, either in a business or in a city or a state
Mhm.
or a nation. There's incentive structures you can promote. But having a culture where it's just like it's not okay just to be an a-hole and do the wrong thing is very difficult to do. It's almost like I'm not sure if it's against human nature. I think we just live in a world where there's not as much accountability because we don't know the people that we're like seeing every day. Like we interact with a lot of strangers, which is kind of counter to how humans, came up in the world. And like I went to Iceland a few years back, and I was talking with our tour guide, and we drove right past like the one prison in Iceland, right
Yeah.
outside Reykjavik. And he's like, yeah, he's like, it's weird. He's like, in Iceland, we don't really understand crime, like we don't understand it. I mean, they have some criminals, but it's rare. And I'm
Yeah.
like, what do you mean? And he goes, well, like we all know each other here around Reykjavik. Like, so like you'd be committing a crime against someone that you know, your family, your second cousin, your friend, and then your family would be ashamed because they knew you committed a crime,
Yep.
but they also know that like you committed a crime against someone that they know. So
Yep.
like there's this like mesh network of accountability that keeps people from doing the wrong thing. And I thought that was really eye-opening for me.
Yeah. And I think it's not just keeping people from doing the wrong thing. It's also about, and I hate to use the word value here because I think I don't ever want to use that when I'm talking about the human soul, if you will, right? But if you're talking dollars and cents from a business perspective, how do you squeeze the most value out of your employees? It's not time in front of the office. It really isn't. If they have passion, if they have love for what they're doing, and that's one of the things I think that I have seen is I've worked for companies where you could ask anybody what the mission statement is and they know what it is, right?
Wow.
And not only do they know what it is, but they take it almost as a religious requirement, if you will. It's very similar to somebody who makes a vow, honestly. And I've worked in companies where, hey, what's the mission statement? They have no flipping clue, and they really don't care. And just like you said, the only person they're taking care of is themselves and maybe the buddy that they've come to trust, in the workplace. And so I think when you have a system where people trust one another and they really do believe the mission or the values that the organization is about, you can get way more work from them and everyone is happier for it. So yeah,
Oh yeah, it's magical. Yeah, I've experienced that a few times in my life, and it's really inspiring to think about. I'm just reflecting on those times in my life where I had that, and it's like, oh man, I want to replicate that in my own life, and it's hard to do at a large organization. I'll be honest with you, it's
it
harder to
is.
do, as an organization scales. Props to any, even medium-sized businesses out there that have a great culture and people aren't like dreading going to work every day. But it's hard to do.
Yeah. Well, but I will say that though as well is the ability for high level leaders to impact, is I I think people underestimate it way too much.
They do.
And I have seen leaders that just absolutely demotivate and destroy. And I've seen leaders who come in and they don't spend very much time, and it inspires people to lean in and push forward. But I think the moment that the scales tip and um, people see, if you will, others taking advantage of the system and not giving back, then it's only a matter of time once that happens. And so, there's a lot going on we could talk about socially, like for example, like the United Healthcare incident, right?
Oh wow, yeah.
That really strongly indicate that. And so, yeah, I think if you want a high trust, high value society, you got to cultivate those things, and you got to build that trust. And for portions of society that haven't had that for generations, you're not going to fix it in one go, you know. And that's something I think about a lot. Is a lot of the I don't think you have to do it through religion, but a lot of the things that you want to expand beyond your own generation to your kids and your grandkids, it really is around that value, that culture mindset, you know. So
Yeah, I think you're right. It's a generational issue either way. I mean, it takes generations to build that type of society, but also takes generations to erode those type of values that you're talking about.
I'd agree. Yeah.
And I think about this too. That you made me think about something I heard recently. One of my friends was saying that they're very secular, like they're not religious people,
Mhm.
but they're finding, they've done very well in their professional career and they have two kids, but they're finding that they're missing like that
Yeah.
stability and that those values, and they want their kids to be around people that are high value people, like people that have principles, and so they're
Mhm.
looking at going to church.
Yeah.
Not even for the religious or spiritual reasons, just for the community and to be around high integrity people and to have their kids kind of espouse some of those morals. And I thought that
Yeah.
was very interesting because, these people, I would never expect them to go to church, but they're actively seeking out churches just for those reasons that you cited.
Well, and it's interesting because I have a friend of mine. He was secular, didn't really have any kind of faith direction or anything. Recently got married, and he and his wife now are planning on starting a family. And that obviously, lots of times, those life changes bring up these kinds of conversations. And so, me and him kind of got into it because he knew I was fairly religious, and so we discussed more and more. And he kind of talked a little bit about the flack or the pushback that he got from family or friends. And I said, you really need to talk to them and help them understand that, they may look at some of these things, and whether you believe literally or not, in my opinion, I personally don't believe it matters, and I'll explain why. So, if you've read the book *Sapiens*, right? Yuval Noah Harari, I think, is his name. One of the things he points out is like a human superpower is to essentially create things that aren't real and then provide value or meaning. And so I got into a discussion with my friend about this concept or idea. And it's funny, when you talk about Christianity, they talk about the body of Christ, right? Corpus Christi. When you talk about businesses, what do we call it? A corporation. And so every day of the week, you punch in, you punch out to arguably an entity that's not real, right? that
Yeah.
is essentially just a conglomeration that we've created in our mind,
Or a
and
PO box in
we've
Delaware.
provided value and meaning to it, right?
Yeah.
And
Oh
and they're
yeah.
using the same language that religions use is it really that bad to just go and find one that meets all of your emotional and your spiritual values and then
Yeah,
provide meaning to it just like you do your work every day? I don't think
well
that's a
said.
crazy statement. And I hope that Western religions can adopt more of that symbolic, people who just believe it symbolically instead of literally, and then leave space for them to believe literally later on. And I think if that's to happen, I think you could see a reversal of some of the trends that we're seeing in Western religions. So yeah,
Yeah, no, a lot of the churches I know, even where I live, are, they're doing well. I mean, the churches can support themselves because they have a lot of, older, well-off donors, but they're having a difficult time bringing in younger people to the church for,
yep,
like it's kind of a trend. I mean, we saw it in Europe first. We're seeing it certainly in the United States that, people aren't actively involved in some sort of religious or spiritual practice. Yeah, I don't necessarily think it's a good thing.
yeah, and I think sometimes it's really easy to kind of, I call it Alice in Wonderland syndrome, where you go down the rabbit hole and you focus on one thing or another. Every once in a while, you gotta step back and look at the larger picture. And one of the things that was funny, over this holiday weekend, I've had a chance to interact with a lot of family. But one of the discussions we got on was look at the millennial generation. You know what I mean? We were told just go to college, get a degree, you'll be fine. That didn't always work out for a lot of folks the way we intended.
Nope.
We were told, churches are good, pastors are great. Just go build in your community, have faith, have trust in your community. And unfortunately, right, a lot of the mega churches with how they handled money. You look at what happened with the Catholic Church. Similarly, our generation and obviously with the war on terror, there's a lot of frustration, I think, with Iraq and Afghanistan. And so there was all of these hallowed institutions, right? And then government and how we vote and whether our vote even matters is another one I could talk about. So you look at all these hallowed institutions like the military, like religion, like education, and I think a lot of people are feeling like they were sold a bill of goods. And if the societal compact or construct doesn't work, people aren't going to work for society. You're not going to see any 2 kilo bars of silver lying around, right? They're going to be snatched up immediately. So I think it's really important for people to understand the holistic aspect, and a lot of creating that value and that purpose, I think, starts in the home,
Does.
right? And then building out to the community. But again, you can't just solve it. You got to solve it on all of those fronts. And I think once we do and we get that trust, that institutional trust back, you know what I mean? Then we can start moving forward. So yeah.
Yeah. No, I agree with you. I think I like that terminology too, institutional trust, because it's just so much easier to do everything if you live in a society where
Yeah.
there's high trust and people aren't watching their back. They're not afraid of getting mugged or getting their stuff stolen off their porch. It's just everything is easier. And, people don't often realize that, we're seeing a lot more theft across major metropolitan cities. I mean, it's happening in my city too. Um, and people don't realize like the underlying cost of that is okay. Well, now Home Depot has to write off $1 billion worth of power tools on their
Yep.
balance sheet, right? They basically write it off. And what do you think they're going to do? Like, are they going to accept a lower profit margin because now people
Yeah.
are thieves? No, they're just going to charge more. Or, local businesses will just have to, pay more for their insurance premiums, and uh, and that cost is passed on to you as the
To the
consumer.
consumer. Yep. Yeah.
So
100%.
it's not like to me there's no such thing as like a victimless crime.
No.
Like it erodes the moral fiber of society. It makes everything more expensive. It makes everything more difficult, and it just sucks. It just plain sucks, honestly. I mean, if anyone that's ever lived in a terrible situation like that knows that it's just not fun to be in that
No.
situation.
Yeah. For sure.
But yeah, I mean, I always like to reserve like the last few minutes of the podcast to allow the guest, you, John, to really talk about whatever you'd like, or you're welcome to ask me any questions that might be on your mind. I try to really highlight the guest for like the last 3 to 5 minutes of the podcast to really choose whatever you'd like to talk about.
Yeah, I mean, I don't, obviously I was kind of freeballing just going into this interview. Just figure we'll go with whatever, right? But I would say, you know, I mean, yeah, I guess maybe I'm trying to think. I'm a lot easier when it was, we're just casually talking and slide into things. But I don't know if you have any questions for me. Maybe you got a
Yeah.
question that will like, spark me into my final 5 minutes here. I don't know.
Yeah. So I was curious. One thing that I've been wanting to ask you is,
Mm,
how do you envision, right now and then in the future, how do you envision like AI and robotics kind of weaving themselves into your life? And how do you view like your interface with machines today? And like
yeah.
if you're using AI in your workflow or your personal or professional endeavors, and then how do you see that emerging in the next 5 to 7 years? I'm of the mindset where like I don't think my kids will ever drive a car. I think they'll all be autonomous, but
Yeah.
that's probably on the extreme end. But I'm curious to hear your thoughts, like in your own life, how that what that looks like.
Yeah. So, I think, and, maybe this doesn't get at the heart of the question, but I think it's worth mentioning. One of the things that I've always seen with any kind of step change in innovation is usually you have to have an event that shakes everyone out, right? So the best example I always point to is obviously the .com bust in the early 2000s. We haven't seen that with AI yet. I don't think we've seen it with robotics either. I don't even know if robotics has gotten the attention enough to have that kind of a shakeout, right? So we'll see. But I think kind of the first thing that has to happen is you need to have a major event where the the small fries get shaken out and you're left with your Googles, your Amazons, right? Your Nvidias, whatever have you. So I think that it's hard to predict time wise what's going to happen until that shakeout occurs, right? And I think that shakeout is bound to happen. I wouldn't be surprised if it happened this year, but I don't know how it can go more than like 2 or 3 more years before it happens. I think it's possible that we hit a gold nugget and that unleashes in crazy amounts of innovation that will keep us ahead of a crash like that. But there's no guarantee. So I guess for my opinion, I think first you have to see that crash. You have to kind of see how that shake out. And then what that enables or what that does is it helps the right money and capital flow to the businesses that really are doing the right things, right? So I would say that's one of the first things you have to see. The second thing you have to see is, I've used Chat GPT a little bit, and I've kind of played around with AI models. My son messes around with them a lot. He does a lot of music and other types of things with it. And for my type of work, when it comes to things like training or just regurgitating general information from the internet, it's fantastic.
Yep.
Where it comes into a lot of, what I do is they call industrial hygiene a science and an art. The art part, that it doesn't do very well. It has a hard time when it comes to looking at risk and really, understanding what's the next action that needs to be done. So I think there's a lot of work there that needs to be done. And then the other thing that I think needs to happen is there's all these memes out there that show kind of an entire software network, if you will, that's relying on something that was coded back in the early 90s. And I'm sure working for the Department of Defense, you've seen that, right?
Oh yeah. Frequently.
And so I wonder, like, to me, kind of a lot of those foundations need to be redone for AI to really be robust and strong. So I see that AI first, you'll see a crash, and then you'll have the big dogs kind of pick up the pieces. And I think a lot of your legacy software companies are going to go bankrupt. And the
Totally.
reason is because if I don't have to pay a programmer hundreds of thousands of dollars to build me X program to do Y thing, you're going to see a lot of big companies manufacturing, internalize those kinds of software. And then I think when that happens, you're going to see a lot of kind of the base structure, hopefully, rewritten. And what I hope is that, your IP, your a lot of your regulations don't get in the way of rewriting a lot of that stuff. And I'll just give you one kind of high level example. So I work a lot with chemical databases. So I pull information, ACGIH, ECA, PubChem, all these different locations. And I've tried to work with my son to do APIs to pull some of that information out, and it doesn't look good. It's not. It's really really messy. And so that's like an example. So getting a chemical database that's worldwide, that's standardized, that can easily output information. Does that make sense?
It
So
does.
to me, when AI is really going to take off, crash, rewrite some of those foundations. Hopefully, government and other people don't get in the way. IP people get in the way. And then once that foundation is there, then you'll just see things take off like crazy. So that's kind of on the AI side. And then really robotics, in my opinion, is merely the real world in action of AI. That's all it is. It's
Yeah.
basically giving a body to the consciousness, hopefully a good consciousness of AI, right?
Hoping not
So
Skynet.
yeah, so you got to watch out for that Skynet. So, I think intertwining and what this is one of the things. So I'm a really big fan. One of the most spiritual books that I read was called The Singularity is Near. Highly recommend that book for anybody. It's old. I think it was written in the early 2000s. I still think it's relevant today. But one of the things he talks about is how through AI and robotics, we're going to create, if you will, God. That's Kurzweil's kind of take, if you will. And what I've always kind of said is, we're going to create essentially the God that we want. And so if we're vindictive, if we're going to use those technologies to carry out selfish desires and selfish intent, that's what we're making. And that's what AI will be. And so my hope is we can take AI, we can take robotics, we can incorporate it into our daily lives and hopefully provide a lot of our own value and our own intent, to carrying out the good things, creating beneficial things for society, helping people, serving people, um, and doing so in a way that it we still maintain our humanity, if you will. So yeah, I don't know.
Oh,
That was a lot of
so
roundabout talking about a lot of different random stuff, but you're not always gonna get a straight answer from me. So yeah,
no, that was so well said. Yeah, I like your optimism about the future. I think you're 100% correct. I don't see a reality where there's like 10 or 12 major LLMs that we all use. I think there'll be like 3 to 5, and then people will just build tools using those as the foundation. I think having like a worldwide um, database of chemicals, both helpful and dangerous chemicals, would be super relevant. I think that seems like something that'd be really good for society, especially people that are trying to, protect people from exposure. So yeah, all those things like resonate deeply with me, and those are all good applications of the technology. So
yeah. So exciting times.
yeah, dude. Well, I'm
We'll be
I'm
around
grateful to
for
call
it.
your.
So yeah,
I know. I'm excited.
take your
I'm.
vitamins, right?
I know it. Well, I'm grateful to call you a friend, and yeah, feel free to stay on for 2 seconds, and thanks for coming on. I appreciate
Yeah.
you.
No, thank you.
All right, let me end this recording real quick, and then it'll upload.